There is a being described in the book of Job. A being that God himself points to in front of a heavenly assembly and asks a question. A question that has never been fully answered by any seminary, any commentary, or any tradition in 2,000 years of Christian theology. Not a question about power. Not a question about punishment. God looks at this creature and asks, "Have you considered my servant Job?" And what follows is not a test of Job's faith. It is a negotiation with something that still had access to the divine counsel. The official version of this story tells you that Satan appears before God to challenge Job's integrity. That is not wrong, but it is incomplete, in a way that changes everything about how you understand the nature of evil, the structure of the spiritual world, and why suffering exists at all. There is a detail in the original Hebrew that translators have consistently softened, because if you render it literally, it raises a question about the architecture of heaven that most theologians prefer not to answer directly. The word used in Job 1:6 for the beings who present themselves before God is B'nai HaElohim, sons of God. Not angels, not messengers, not servants, sons. And among them, he came also. The Hebrew text does not say Satan arrived from somewhere outside. It says he came among them. The preposition is betokem, in the midst of them. He was part of the assembly. He had standing. He had access. He was not crashing a meeting he had been excluded from. He walked in. Now hold that image for a moment, because the word translated as Satan in this text is not a proper name in the original Hebrew. It is the definite article ha, followed by the noun satan. Ha-satan, the adversary, the accuser, the one who functions as a legal opponent. In ancient Hebrew legal culture, the Satan was a recognized role, a prosecuting attorney, someone who stood in the court and made the case against the defendant. The term describes a function, not just an identity. Which means what is happening in Job chapter 1 is a cosmic legal proceeding. A case is being opened, and the accuser is not an outsider who broke in. He is a recognized participant in the proceedings of the divine counsel. This is where most modern readings completely miss the weight of what is happening. If you grew up hearing that Satan was cast out of heaven before Genesis chapter 1, you have to reconcile that with the fact that in Job, a book most scholars date as among the oldest texts in the entire Hebrew canon, he is still walking into the assembly of heaven and presenting himself before God with a speaking role. There are 3 layers of evidence that help resolve this tension, and they come from sources that rarely appear in Sunday morning sermons. The first layer is canonical. The book of Job is not the only place in Hebrew scripture where the divine counsel appears. Psalm 82 opens with God standing in the congregation of El, the assembly of divine beings, rendering judgment against them. The Hebrew word there is Ada, a formal gathering with legal weight. Psalm 89:7 describes God as greatly to be feared in the assembly of the holy ones, in the council of heaven. 1 Kings chapter 22 records the prophet Micaiah seeing the entire host of heaven standing before the throne, with individual beings speaking and responding. The divine counsel is not a metaphor in Hebrew theology. It is a structural reality that runs through the entire Old Testament. And within that counsel, the accuser held a position, a corrupted position, a position being actively used against humanity, but a position nonetheless. The second layer comes from the book of Job, as understood through the Dead Sea Scrolls, particularly the Targum of Job, found at Qumran, designated 11 QTG Job, This Aramaic translation, dating to the 1st century BCE, was clearly studied by the Qumran community. It renders the divine council scene with striking specificity. The beings who present themselves are described in a way that emphasizes their delegated authority over regions and nations. And the adversaries movement is described not as intrusion, but as patrol. A being who has been moving through the earth in a supervisory capacity, covering it, surveying it. That word covering connects directly back to Ezekiel 28, where the same root is used to describe what the anointed cherub was appointed to do before his fall. Sakak, to cover, to oversee, to function as a protective veil between the holy and the profane. The implication is that the being in Job still retains the form of his original function, while having inverted its purpose entirely. He still moves through the earth, he still surveys, he still presents reports to the council. But now the reports are accusations. Now the oversight has become predation. The third layer comes from Josephus, the 1st century Jewish historian whose Antiquities of the Jews provides the most detailed non-canonical account of how Second Temple Judaism understood these texts. Josephus writes in Antiquities Book 1 that the beings who transgressed the boundaries assigned to them did so not through ignorance. They did so through deliberate rejection of a designated order. He uses the Greek word parabasis, a stepping across a boundary that one knows is there, not a stumble. A step. This is precisely what Job chapter 1 shows in compressed form. The adversary is not confused about where he is or what the rules are. He walks into the assembly, engages in legal argumentation, and proposes a test that God permits within defined limits. God says, "He is in your hand, but do not touch his life." Limits, boundaries, legal parameters. Evil in the book of Job is not chaos. It is not randomness. It is a corrupted intelligence operating within a permitted perimeter, trying to use the mechanics of justice to destroy what it can no longer touch through brute force. And this is where the ancient text speaks directly into the present moment in a way that should stop you cold. The specific method the adversary uses in Job is not violence. He does not arrive with a weapon. He arrives with a thesis. This man only serves God because of what he receives from God. Remove the blessing, and the worship disappears. Take away the protection, and the loyalty collapses. That thesis is the same thesis being tested in millions of lives right now. Every person who has ever sat in a hospital room and asked God why. Every person who has watched something they built collapse without explanation. Every person who has given everything they had to a calling and received loss instead of reward. Every one of those moments is the adversary presenting the same argument to the same court. He thinks you're only faithful because faithfulness is comfortable. And the entire book of Job is God's rebuttal. Not a theological argument, a life. A real human being who lost everything, who did not receive clean answers, who sat in ash and argued with heaven, and who refused to disconnect his worship from his God, even when he could not reconcile his suffering with his theology.
That is the answer to the adversary's accusation. Not doctrine, not performance. A person who holds on when the logic runs out. But here is what most readings of Job miss entirely, and it is the most important detail in the book. At the end of Job, God does not explain himself to Job. He does not answer Job's questions. He responds to Job's questions with questions of his own. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? When the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy? The Hebrew verb there for shouted is ranan,
a shout of triumph, of exuberant rejoicing, of the kind of sound that cannot be contained. The sons of God, the same B'nai Ha-Elohim from chapter 1, shouted with joy at creation. Which means, before any of this, before the council scenes, before the accusation, before the test, there was a moment when every being in the heavenly assembly, including the one who would become the adversary, witnessed the creation of the universe and responded with uncontained worship. He knew. He was there. He saw it from the beginning. And he chose to become what he became anyway. That is not a story about ignorance. That is not a story about being deceived. That is a story about a being who stood in the presence of the glory of God at the moment of creation, who heard the music of the morning stars, who participated in the first act of cosmic worship, and then slowly, over a trajectory that Scripture traces but never fully explains, turned that original joy into accusation. The same mouth that once sang at the birth of the universe now stands before the throne and lists the reasons why human beings do not deserve grace. And the reason this matters for your life today is not abstract.
You were made in the image of a God who creates and delights and gives. You carry within you the capacity for that same original joy, that same morning star song. And you also carry within you the capacity for the same inversion, the slow drift from worship to performance, from trust to transaction, from relationship to accusation, first of others and eventually of God himself. Every time you approach God primarily as a record keeper who owes you something, you are reasoning in the structure of the adversary's argument. Every time your faith depends entirely on the outcome rather than the person, you are standing inside the thesis that the accuser brought before the council. Job's answer, and the only answer that actually defeats that argument, is not perfect theology. It is continued orientation toward God in the dark. Not because the answers came, because the relationship held. And there is one more thing in this text that almost no one mentions in discussions of Job. After the test, after the restoration, after everything is returned and multiplied, God says to Job's 3 friends, the ones who gave theologically correct speeches about suffering being the result of sin, God says, "You have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has." Job who argued with God. Job who demanded an audience. Job who said things in his anguish that no comfort gospel preacher would put on a motivational card. Job whose words were raw and broken and sometimes bordered on accusation. God said Job spoke rightly. Because honest wrestling with the living God is more accurate speech than polished theology delivered at a safe distance. The adversary wanted Job silent or cursing. Either outcome would have proven the accusation. Job chose a third path that the accuser had never accounted for. A man who would fight with God rather than abandon him, who would demand an answer rather than walk away, and who would, in the end, receive not an explanation, but a presence. And the presence was enough. That is what the book of Job is actually about. Not the problem of suffering as a philosophical puzzle. Not a test passed by gritted teeth endurance. It is the story of a being who chose accusation over worship, losing his case to a man who chose presence over explanation. The heavenly council has not changed its nature. The accuser does not come to you with horns and fire. He comes with a reasonable-sounding thesis about whether your faith is real,
whether God is actually good, whether what you lost was worth the cost of your loyalty. The answer is not an argument. The answer is Job. Real, broken, furious, faithful Job sitting in the ash, who looked at the universe and said, "Though he slay me, yet will I trust him." If this text is touching something in you that you have not been able to name for a long time, leave a comment below with one word. The emotion you felt when you heard that Job's honest wrestling was more right in God's eyes than polished religious answers. Just one word. I want to read every single one. And in the next video, we are going inside the Hebrew of Genesis 6, the verse about the sons of God and the daughters of men. And we are going to look at what the oldest manuscripts, the Book of Giants from Qumran and Josephus, all agree happened before the flood that no modern translation has been willing to say plainly.
Subscribe and turn the bell on now, because what is coming next will permanently change how you read the first 9 chapters of Genesis.